The same haunting melody pierced through Roberto's nightmare, as it did every night. His fingers twitched against the sheets, playing phantom notes on an invisible violin while flames danced behind his closed eyelids. A white piano emerged from the smoke, its keys melting like wax. "No!" Roberto bolted upright in his narrow bed, his white-knuckled hands clutching the threadbare blanket. Moonlight filtered through the orphanage's cracked window, casting shadows on the peeling walls. From across the room came a small whimper. "Roberto!" Felicity's voice trembled. "The pain's back." He was at her bedside in an instant, violin already in hand. His sister's face was pale, her 8-year-old features twisted in discomfort as she pressed a hand against her chest. Roberto positioned the violin under his chin, letting muscle memory guide his movement. "Just breathe with the music, Fel," he whispered, drawing the bow across the strings. The melody that emerged wasn't the one from his nightmares, but a gentler tune he'd composed just for her. Felicity's breathing slowly steadied, but Roberto couldn't miss the bluish tinge around her lips. Tomorrow's doctor's appointment couldn't come soon enough. Roberto," Sister Margaret's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence. The elderly nun stood in the doorway, her face grave. "A word, please." He placed the violin carefully in its worn case and followed her into the hallway. The linoleum floor was cold under his bare feet. "The hospital called," Sister Margaret said softly. "They're requiring payment before Felicity's next treatment." Roberto's stomach dropped. "Oh, but you said the orphanage fund has been depleted." She touched his shoulder gently. "I'm so sorry." Thunder rumbled outside as Roberto made his way to the train station later that morning, violin case clutched protectively against his chest. The first drops of rain began to fall as he set up in his usual spot near the ticket counter. He'd barely started playing when he felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched. Through the crowd of commuters, a tall man in an expensive coat stood absolutely still, his gray eyes fixed on Roberto's hands. There was something unsettling about his intensity, about the way his expression shifted when Roberto transitioned into the melody from his dreams. The man took a step forward, but at that moment, a scream cut through the station. "Felicity!" Roberto's bow clattered to the ground. His sister had followed him to the station, and now lay crumpled near a bench, her small body convulsing. "Someone call an ambulance!" Roberto cradled her head, his fingers trembling as he checked her pulse. "Please, help!" Strong hands gently moved him aside. The man with the gray eyes knelt beside Felicity, his movements precise and calm. "I'm Señor Aguilara," he said, his accent carrying a hint of Spanish. "My car is outside. We'll get her to the hospital faster than waiting for an ambulance." Roberto hesitated for a split second, but another spasm racked Felicity's body. He nodded, gathering his sister in his arms while Aguilara picked up the violin case. As they rushed through the rain to a waiting black car, Roberto caught the man studying him with an expression that seemed almost hungry. The last thing he saw before the car door closed was his violin case in Aguilara's grip, raindrops falling like tears on its worn surface. The fluorescent lights of the hospital's conference room cast harsh shadows across Mrs. Chen's face as she flipped through Señor Aguilara's paperwork. The social worker's expression remained neutral, but her rapid pen-tapping betrayed her unease. "You understand our concerns, Mr. Aguilara," she said. "When ni, a single man, seeking to adopt 2 children he met mere hours ago." Roberto, seated between Felicity's hospital bed and the conference table, studied the man who'd saved his sister. Something about Aguilara's perfectly pressed suit and carefully controlled expressions made him think of a performer before a crucial recital. I assure you, my interest in these children is entirely," Aguilara paused, choosing his words carefully, "legitimate." "Why us?" Roberto blurted out. The adults turned to him, startled. "You've been watching me at the station for weeks. I've seen you." A flash of something, guilt, fear, crossed Aguilara's face. "The melody you were playing, I recognized it." "Impossible," Roberto said. I made it up." "Did you?" Aguilara reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Or did you remember it?" Mrs. Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Aguilara, if you have information about these children's background, please." Felicity's small voice interrupted from the bed. Her face was still pale, but some color had returned to her cheeks. "Please let us go with him. Roberto needs his violin, and she touched her chest. "I need the surgery." Roberto's throat tightened. The violin case still sat at Agulara's feet, like bait in a trap. "Let me show you something," Agulara said softly, opening the folder. He pulled out a photograph that made Roberto's heart skip a beat. A woman with flame-red hair and piercing blue eyes, his eyes, sat at a white piano, her expression caught in mid-laugh. "Who?" Roberto's voice cracked. "Why, all in good time," Agulara said, quickly returning the photo to the folder. "First, let's discuss the adoption papers." The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and legal terms. Mrs. Chen's questions grew more pointed, but Agulara deflected them with practiced ease. Roberto barely heard any of, his mind fixed on that photograph and the strange familiarity of the white piano. That night, their last at St. Catherine's orphanage, Roberto couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed, watching Felicity pack her few belongings into a small suitcase. "Aren't you scared?" he asked. Felicity paused, holding her favorite worn teddy bear. "Remember what Mom used to say about music?" Roberto stiffened. "We don't talk about that. It always leads us home," she continued, ignoring his protest. "When you play that melody, the one from your dreams, I feel like we're getting closer to something. Don't you?" Before he could answer, Sister Margaret appeared in the doorway. "It's time," she said softly. "Mr. Aguilara is waiting." Roberto took one last look at the small room that had been their home for the past 3 years. Jimmy, his bunkmate, watched from his bed with red-rimmed eyes. "Your violin playing kept the nightmares away," Jimmy whispered. "What'll we do now?" Roberto forced a smile. "Hey, maybe I'll come back and teach you someday." Outside, rain fell again as they walked to Aguilara's waiting car. Roberto clutched his violin case close, trying to ignore the way Aguilara's eyes followed his every movement. As the orphanage disappeared into the gloom behind them, he felt Felicity's small hand slip into his. The melody from his dreams echoed in his head, stronger than ever, as they drove into the unknown. His violin case felt unusually heavy in his lap, weighted down with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Lightning split the sky as Aguilara's car wound up the hill toward the mansion. Roberto pressed his forehead against the cool glass, counting the seconds between flash and thunder. Beside him, Felicity had fallen asleep, her breath fogging the window in steady rhythms. The iron gates creaked open, revealing a towering Victorian structure that seemed to pierce the storm clouds above. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Roberto caught movement behind a second-floor window, a girl's face quickly vanishing behind heavy curtains. "Home at last," Aguilara announced, his voice oddly tight. "Maria will show you to your rooms." They had barely stepped into the marble foyer when a figure emerged from the shadows of the grand staircase. A girl about Roberto's age descended slowly, her gray eyes, so like her father's, fixed on the violin case in his hands. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her expression was carefully blank. "Cecilia?" Aguilara said. "Meet your new siblings." She didn't respond. Instead, she brushed past them, her shoulder deliberately connecting with Roberto's. The violin case almost slipped from his grip. "I'll take the children upstairs." Maria, the elderly housekeeper, stepped forward. Her accent was thick, her eyes kind but worried. "Come, come, before you catch death in these wet clothes." As they followed Maria up the winding staircase, Roberto noticed dozens of photographs lining the walls. Most featured Cecilia at various piano competitions, her face growing progressively more serious with each passing year. The most recent showed her seated at a gleaming black grand piano, but her hands were positioned wrong, almost as if, "She doesn't really play anymore," Maria whispered, catching his gaze. "Not since." She stopped abruptly, making the sign of the cross. Their rooms were adjacent, connected by a shared bathroom. Roberto's was dominated by a massive 4-poster bed, but what caught his attention was the music stand positioned near the window, clearly new. "Get some rest," Maria said, but paused at the door. "And perhaps it's best not to wander at night. These old houses, they keep secrets best left alone." Later, unable to sleep, Roberto found himself drawn to the faint sound of music. He followed it down the corridor, past sleeping portraits and shadows that seemed to move on their own. The melody grew stronger, hauntingly familiar. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall, moonlight spilling from within. Roberto peered inside and froze. There, shrouded in darkness, stood a white piano. His fingers trembled as he approached it. The keys were dusty except for a few recent fingerprints. Without thinking, He pressed one note, then another, recreating the melody from his dream. "Don't touch that." Roberto spun around. Cecilia stood in the doorway, her face white with fury. "This room is forbidden. I was just—" "You don't belong here," she hissed. "Either of you. I heard you playing at the station. You're nothing but a charity case with a party trick." Something flashed in Roberto's mind, red hair catching firelight, the same white piano, laughter mixing with music. He staggered, gripping the piano for support. "Get out!" Cecilia advanced into the room. "Before I—" "Cecilia!" Maria's voice cut through the tension. "Your father would be most displeased to find you here." Cecilia's face contorted, and for a moment, Roberto thought he saw tears in her eyes. She fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. "That piano," Roberto turned to Maria. "Why does it feel like—" "Some memories are best left buried, child." Maria's weathered hand gripped his shoulder. "Come, back to bed." That night, Felicity woke screaming about a red-haired woman playing piano in flames. From his room, Roberto heard Cecilia pacing above, her footsteps tracing the same pattern as the melody that haunted them all. Just before dawn, he discovered the locked door on the third floor, its keyhole black as a watching eye. And from the shadows at the end of the hall, unseen, Cecilia observed his every move, her fingers silently playing phantom notes in the air. The grandfather clock struck 3 as Roberto crept down the mansion's east wing, his sock-clad feet silent on the Persian runners. Moonlight filtered through towering windows, turning the corridor into a maze of silver and shadow. He'd woken to that melody again, but this time it wasn't in his dreams. It drifted up through the floorboards, real and haunting. The music grew stronger as he descended the servants' staircase. It was coming from somewhere beneath the house, a piano nocturne, played with technical precision but something else too, a barely contained fury in each note. He followed the sound to a heavy door tucked beneath the main staircase. It opened with a betraying creak, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The melody echoed off the walls, clearer now. At the bottom of the stairs, Roberto froze. Through a partially opened door, he could see Cecilia at an old upright piano, her back rigid, hands flying over the yellowed keys. Her hair was wild, nightgown wrinkled, as if she'd been playing for hours. "You're supposed to be in bed," she said without turning, her fingers never stopping. "This is my time, my place. You told everyone you don't play anymore." Her hands crashed onto the keys, the discordant sound making them both flinch. "Because I don't? Not really." She finally turned, and in the dim light, he could see tears on her cheeks. "Not since she—" "Since who?" Cecilia stood abruptly, the piano bench scraping against concrete. "Why does father watch you play? Why did he really bring you here?" "I don't know," Roberto admitted, "but I keep having these memories. A white piano, a woman with red hair." "Stop." Cecilia pressed her hands against her ears. "You can't talk about her. It's forbidden." A sudden thud from above made them both look up. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. "Miss Cecilia?" Maria's voice called from upstairs. "Are you down there again?" They shared a panicked look. Cecilia grabbed Roberto's arm, pulling him into a dark alcove just as Maria's footsteps descended the stairs. The housekeeper's flashlight beams swept past their hiding spot. "These midnight concerts must stop," Maria muttered to herself as she checked the empty piano room. The master won't be pleased." Roberto became acutely aware of Cecilia's warmth pressed against him in the tight space, her breath quick against his neck. They waited in tense silence until Maria's footsteps retreated. "There are letters," Cecilia whispered, her lips close to his ear. "In that trunk behind the piano. I've never dared to read them, but maybe you—" A scream from upstairs shattered the moment. "Felicity!" Roberto bolted from the alcove, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found his sister thrashing in her bed, caught in some terrible nightmare. "The Red Lady," she whimpered as he held her. "She was burning. Roberto, the piano was burning too." Heavy footsteps approached, and Aguilara appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "Is she—" "Her heart," Roberto said. "The doctor said any stress could—" "I'll call Dr. Matthews." Aguilara turned to leave but paused. "Roberto, there's something you should know about your mother." "My mother?" But Felicity's monitor began beeping erratically, and the moment was lost in the chaos that followed. Later, as dawn broke over the mansion, Roberto overheard fragments of a conversation from Agulara's study. Can't keep hiding the truth. Carmen's children. The fire wasn't an accident. Roberto pressed his back against the wall, heart pounding. In his mind, the melody that had haunted his dreams took on a new, terrifying significance. He had to find those letters in the basement. Whatever secret Agulara was keeping, whatever had happened to his mother, the truth was hidden somewhere in this house of whispers and shadows. The National Youth Music Competition. Agulara announced at breakfast, sliding a glossy brochure across the mahogany table. Both of you will enter. Roberto looked up from his untouched toast, catching Cecilia's startled expression. They hadn't spoken since their midnight encounter 3 days ago. Father, I don't… This isn't a request, Cecilia. Agulara's tone left no room for argument. You and Roberto will perform a violin-piano duet in the ensemble category. But we've never even played together, Roberto protested. A thin smile crossed Agulara's face. Then I suggest you start practicing. The conservatory was flooded with morning light when they met for their first rehearsal. Cecilia sat at the black grand piano, her posture perfect, refusing to look at Roberto as he unpacked his violin. Bach's Concerto in D minor, she said flatly, placing the sheet music on their stands. Think you can handle it? Roberto had barely positioned his bow when the conservatory door burst open. A tall boy about their age strode in, violin case swinging casually from one hand. Viktor Kovalev, he announced with a slight Russian accent. Your competition. Cecilia's hands slipped on the keys, producing a jarring chord. Why? What are you doing here? Your father invited me to stay until the competition. Victor's eyes fixed on Roberto's violin. Interesting model. Italian, late 1800s, similar to one I once saw in Milan, belonged to a remarkable violinist named Carmen. Roberto's bow arm trembled. You knew my… Victor. Agulara appeared in the doorway. I believe we discussed discretion. During dinner that evening, Roberto couldn't stop watching Victor, who kept shooting knowing glances his way. The Russian boy handled his knife and fork with the same precise grace he'd shown with his violin during his impromptu performance earlier. Brilliant technique, Agulara had praised. Almost as good as your mother's, Roberto. Now, reaching for his water glass, Roberto noticed Victor slip something into Cecilia's hand beneath the table. Her face went white. After dinner, Roberto followed her into the garden. What did he give you? Nothing. But her voice shook. Cecilia, she spun around, and suddenly they were inches apart. The moonlight caught the tears in her eyes. You don't understand. Victor knows things about your mother, about my father, about the fire. Before Roberto could respond, she grabbed his shirt collar and pressed her lips to his. For one startling moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of her mouth, the scent of her hair. How romantic. Victor's mocking voice cut through the darkness. Does he know you're just like your father, Cecilia? Taking what doesn't belong to you. Leave her alone. Roberto stepped forward, but Victor just laughed. You don't even know what was stolen, do you? What really happened the night of the fire? He pulled an old newspaper clipping from his pocket. Maybe this will help you remember. But before he could hand it over, music burst from the conservatory. Their competition piece, played with raw emotion. They rushed inside to find Cecilia at the piano, her fingers flying over the keys. Well, she challenged Roberto, never stopping. Are you going to play or not? He raised his violin, and for the first time since entering the mansion, everything fell into place. Their music twined together, filling the room with something powerful and dangerous and alive. Victor watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. When they finished, he slowly clapped. Impressive. But tell me, Roberto, do you recognize the original composition this piece was based on? Your mother wrote it, after all. What? But Victor was already walking away, the newspaper clipping still in his pocket, leaving Roberto with more questions and a growing suspicion that every note they played brought them closer to a truth that could destroy them all. Rain drummed against the conservatory windows as Roberto and Cecilia rehearsed late into the evening. The semi-final was 3 days away, and something had shifted between them since their kiss in the garden. Each glance held new weight. Each accidental touch sent electricity through Roberto's skin. Again, Cecilia said, flexing her fingers above the keys. The transition's still rough. Before they could start, Victor materialized in the doorway, rain-soaked and grim. "Found something interesting in town today." He pulled a faded concert program from his jacket. Carmen Aguilar's final performance, the night before the fire. Roberto's bow slipped, screeching across the strings. "That was my mother's name?" "Victor," Cecilia warned, but he continued. "She was a prodigy. Like you." Victor's eyes glittered. "Until your father destroyed everything she'd built." Thunder crashed outside, and the conservatory lights flickered. Cecilia stood so abruptly her piano bench toppled backward. "You don't know anything, don't I?" Victor advanced into the room. "I know she was working on a composition that night. I know your father was the last person to see her alive. And I know—" "That's enough." The new voice belonged to Felicity, standing pale but determined in the doorway. "I remember the melody. From that night, everyone froze. Even the rain seemed to pause." "Fell," Roberto whispered. "You were only 4. She was playing it when the smoke came." Felicity's voice took on a dreamy quality. "It wasn't finished. She kept starting over, trying to get it right." Roberto felt the world tilt. In his mind, fragments of memory began to align. Red hair gleaming in firelight, the smell of smoke, a white piano's keys melting. "Show me," he said hoarsely. "Show me the melody." Felicity walked to the piano, and with one finger, picked out a simple tune. The same one from Roberto's nightmares. The same one he'd been playing at the train station when Aguilara found him. Cecilia gasped. "Father's secret composition. The one he keeps locked in his study. It's your mother's last work," Victor finished. "The one he claimed as his own." Roberto's violin slipped from his grip, but Cecilia caught it before it hit the floor. Their fingers brushed, lingered. In the dim light, her eyes were full of tears. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered, "but Father said it would destroy everything." The semi-final results arrived by mail the next morning. They'd advanced to the finals, but Roberto barely registered the news. He'd spent the night in the library, piecing together newspaper archives, trying to understand, looking for answers. Cecilia found him there, still in her nightgown. Rain continued to pour outside. "Why did your father take us in? Really?" She sank into the chair beside him. "Guilt, I think. He loved your mother. Maybe too much. And my father? The fire. I only know what I've overheard." She reached for his hand. "Father keeps a diary, in his study." But Roberto— Lightning illuminated the library, casting harsh shadows across her face. In that flash, she looked so much like the woman from his memories that his heart stopped. "Some truths are dangerous," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "If Father finds out what we know—" The library door creaked open. They jumped apart as Aguilara entered, his face dark as the storm outside. "The finals are in 2 days," he said quietly. "I suggest you both focus on practicing." His eyes lingered on their still-joined hands. Some pieces of the past are better left unplayed. But as he turned to leave, Roberto caught a glimpse of something in his pocket. A key, the same size as the lock on the white piano room. The melody haunted him as he practiced that night. Each note a question, each rest a secret waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere in the mansion, a diary held the truth about the fire that had destroyed everything, and the man who might have orchestrated it all. The night before the finals, Roberto waited until the mansion fell silent. His violin case held lockpicks instead of his instrument, a skill learned from years on the streets before the orphanage. The study door's lock surrendered after 3 tense minutes. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating Aguilara's massive desk. Roberto's fingers trembled as he worked the drawer locks, each click echoing like gunshots in the silence. The bottom drawer finally yielded, revealing a leather-bound diary beneath stacks of yellowed sheet music. As he lifted it out, several pages fluttered to the floor. His blood froze. The handwriting wasn't Aguilara's, it was his mother's. "I knew you'd come." Roberto spun around. The elderly housekeeper, Maria, stood in the doorway, her face grave in the moonlight. "I was there that night," she said softly, entering the room, "when your mother played her last melody." "Tell me." Maria's hands twisted in her apron. "Carmen was brilliant, too brilliant. She'd discovered something in Senor Aguilara's past, something dark. The composition she wrote that night, it wasn't just music, it was a message." A floorboard creaked outside. Maria's eyes widened in terror. "Quick, behind the curtain!" Roberto barely concealed himself before Cecilia burst in, clutching a manila envelope. "Roberto? I know you're in here." Victor gave me proof. She stopped short at the sight of Maria. The envelope slipped from her fingers, spilling photographs across the floor. Roberto's heart stopped as moonlight revealed their contents. Newspaper clippings about a fire in Milan, 20 years ago. Another pianist, another accident. Dios mío, Maria whispered, crossing herself. It happened before. Footsteps thundered down the hall. Cecilia snatched up the photos, her face ashen. He's coming. Roberto, run! But it was too late. Aguilara filled the doorway, Victor's satisfied smirk visible behind him. I hoped I was wrong about you, Aguilara said quietly. His eyes found Roberto behind the curtain. That you wouldn't be as curious as your mother. What did you do to her? Roberto stepped out, Carmen's diary clutched to his chest. I loved her. Aguilara's voice cracked. She was going to expose everything. The plagiarism, the other fire. I only wanted to destroy the evidence. I never meant— A scream pierced the night. Felicity's voice, filled with terror. Everyone froze. The white piano room, Maria gasped. She sleepwalks there sometimes. Drawn to the melody. They raced upstairs, but the door was locked. Smoke curled beneath it. No, Cecilia whispered. Not again. She turned to her father, eyes wild. What did you do? Nothing. I swear. He's lying. Victor stepped forward. I saw him put the candles there earlier. Insurance money, just like before. Right, sir. Roberto shouldered past them all, ramming the door with desperate force. It splintered open to reveal Felicity unconscious on the floor, flames dancing around the white piano. Fell! He rushed in, scooping up his sister. Her skin was cold, her pulse weak. Back in the hallway, Cecilia stared at her father in horror. This is what happened to Carmen, isn't it? You locked her in? No, you don't understand. Aguilara reached for her say, but she recoiled. Don't touch me. She backed away, bumping into an end table. A bottle of pills clattered to the floor, her antidepressant, her eyes fixed on them for one terrible moment. Cecilia? Roberto called softly, still cradling Felicity. Don't! But she was already running, snatching up the bottle as she fled. Victor started after her, but Roberto's voice stopped him. Haven't you done enough? The Russian boy's face crumpled. I thought exposing him would bring justice. Sirens wailed in the distance as smoke filled the hallway. Roberto looked down at his sister's pale face, then at Carmen's diary in his hand. The truth had nearly cost them everything. Again. Maria, he said hoarsely. Call an ambulance. And the police. He turned to Aguilara, who stood frozen, staring at the burning piano room. It's time for all the melodies to be heard. The hospital waiting room clock ticked past midnight, each second stretching like a bow across taut strings. Roberto sat between two doors, one leading to Felicity's ICU room, the other to where doctors pumped Cecilia's stomach. His mother's diary lay heavy in his lap, its pages still unread. Her heart can't take much more, Dr. Matthews had said of Felicity. Without immediate surgery, a soft sob drew his attention. Maria sat across from him, rosary beads clicking between her fingers. The elderly housekeeper hadn't left since they arrived. The police are questioning Senor Aguilara, she whispered. Victor? He told them everything. Roberto's fingers traced the diary's worn spine. Why didn't you ever say anything? Fear. Maria's hands trembled. The same fear that kept Carmen silent until the ICU doors burst open. Felicity's monitor was screaming. Roberto caught a glimpse of his sister's face, gray and still, before nurses blocked his view. Code Blue! Someone shouted. Get Dr. Matthews! Roberto tried to follow, but firm hands held him back. He struggled until he recognized the touch. Cecilia, pale but alive, hospital gown hanging loose on her frame. You should be in bed, he managed. They can't sedate me again. Her voice was raw. Not until I tell you. She swayed, and he steadied her. Victor found a donor, for Felicity, someone compatible. What? Who? A new voice answered. Me. Victor stood in the doorway, his usual arrogance replaced by something like remorse. My blood type. It matches. I've already signed the consent forms. Roberto stared at the boy who had nearly destroyed them all. Why? Because I was wrong. Victor moved closer, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. This was never about justice. Your mother, she left this for you. The paper was old, edges charred. A letter, dated the night of the fire. Where did you— Found it in Milan. Behind the piano, where she... Victor couldn't finish. Read it, please. Roberto's hands shook as he unfolded the letter. His mother's handwriting danced across the page. My dearest children, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally emerged. But remember, our music was never about revenge. It was about healing, about finding light in darkness. The melody I couldn't finish that night. It wasn't an accusation. It was a prayer for forgiveness. Love, Mama. A doctor appeared, looking grave. The surgery needs to happen now. Where's the donor? Victor stepped forward. Here. As they led him away, he glanced back at Roberto. The competition, you should still play. Finish what your mother started. Cecilia gripped Roberto's hand. He's right. The melody, the one from your dreams. I know how it ends. Before he could respond, Maria rushed in. Senor Aguilara, he's confessed everything. The plagiarism, the fires, but he's asking for you both. Roberto looked between the ICU doors and the direction Victor had gone. His sister's life hung by a thread, while the girl he was falling for could barely stand. And somewhere in the building, the man responsible for it all waited to be heard. The clock struck 1, its chime echoing through empty corridors. Roberto opened his mother's diary, its pages holding 2 decades of secrets. Whatever choice he made next would change everything. Cecilia leaned against him, her breath warm on his neck. Sometimes, she whispered, the hardest notes to play are the ones that heal us. The police interrogation room seemed smaller, with Aguilara hunched over the metal table, his elegant posture finally broken. Roberto and Cecilia sat across from him, Carmen's diary and letter laid between them like a barrier. I never meant for anyone to die, Aguilara began, his voice barely above a whisper. Carmen, she was more than my student. She saw something in my music that I'd lost years ago. You loved her, Cecilia said. It wasn't a question. Too much. His hands shook as he reached for a glass of water. What I lie? When she discovered my secret, that my famous compositions were plagiarized from a dead composer in Milan, she didn't expose me. Instead, she wrote that melody, a chance for redemption. Roberto's fingers instinctively moved, playing phantom notes. The one I keep dreaming about. She wanted to help me confess, to start over. Aguilara's eyes filled with tears. But your father, Roberto, he found out about our affair. He came to the house that night, drunk, violent. When the fire started, it wasn't you, Cecilia whispered. No, but I couldn't save her. The doors, they warped in the heat. By the time I broke through, he covered his face. I've spent every day since searching for her children, trying to make amends. A nurse burst into the room. Mr. Aguilara, your daughter's condition has worsened. Cecilia's face went chalk white. Her earlier overdose had done more damage than they'd thought. The transplant surgery for Felicity is underway, the nurse continued, but we need a family member's consent for Miss Cecilia's procedure. Roberto stood, torn between 2 bedsides, his sister fighting for life in one room, the girl he loved fading in another. Go to Felicity, Cecilia said softly. I'll be fine. But her eyes told a different story. The same despair that had driven her to the pills still lingered there. No, Roberto took her hand. We face this together. All of it. Aguilara watched them, something like hope flickering across his face. The competition finals. They're in 3 hours. We can't possibly... Cecilia started. Your mother's last composition, Aguilara interrupted. The one she wrote that night. I kept it. All these years. Perhaps... He pulled a folded sheet from his jacket. Perhaps it's time it was finally played. Roberto stared at the music, his mother's handwriting both familiar and strange. The melody that had haunted his dreams was there, but different. Not an accusation, but a bridge between past and present. A duet, he realized. She wrote it for 2. Before anyone could respond, Victor appeared in the doorway, pale but standing. Bor, the surgery was successful. Felicity, she's asking for you. Relief crashed over Roberto like a wave, but as he moved to leave, Aguilara caught his arm. There's something else you should know. He looked older than ever in the harsh fluorescent light. Carmen, she knew she might not survive that night. The composition, it's not just music, it's her story, our story, all of it. Then we'll tell it, Cecilia said, standing despite her weakness. On stage, where everyone can hear. Roberto looked at his watch. 3 hours until the finals. 3 hours to learn a piece that had waited 20 years to be played. 3 hours to bridge the gap between tragedy and redemption. For Carmen, Victor said softly. For all of us, Roberto corrected, and took Cecilia's hand. The concert hall hummed with anticipation as Roberto tightened his bow. Backstage, he could hear the murmur of the capacity crowd, drawn by rumors of scandal after Aguilera's arrest had made headlines. 5 minutes, the stagehand announced. Cecilia sat at a practice piano, her hospital bracelet still visible beneath her concert dress sleeve. Against medical advice, she'd checked herself out 2 hours ago. Oh, we only get one chance at this. Roberto touched the sheet music, his mother's final composition. They'd barely had time to rehearse, but somehow, the notes felt written in his blood. Felicity's watching on the hospital feed. Victor appeared, his own performance already finished. The nurses say her color's better. A phone buzzed. Cecilia read the message, her hands trembling. Father's been released on bail. He's in the audience. Roberto's stomach clenched. Through the curtain gap, he could see Aguilera in the front row, flanked by police officers. Their eyes met briefly before the older man looked away. Places, the stagehand called. As they walked onto the stage, the whispers grew. Everyone knew the story now. The fire, the plagiarism, the attempted cover-up, but they didn't know about the melody that had started it all. Roberto positioned his violin as Cecilia settled at the grand piano. The stage lights felt hot, accusatory, like flames. "Ready?" he whispered. Instead of answering, Cecilia began to play. The opening notes were haunting, familiar, the melody from Roberto's dreams. But as his violin joined in, something shifted. The music wasn't just about loss anymore. It spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of love that transcended tragedy. In the audience, Aguilera wept openly. Halfway through, Roberto felt it. The moment his mother's hands had stopped writing, the composition left unfinished in the fire. But instead of faltering, Cecilia transitioned seamlessly into something new. Notes they'd written together in the hospital, watching Felicity recover, a bridge between past and present. The music swelled, violin and piano intertwining like two hearts learning to beat again. Roberto closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could see his mother at her white piano, smiling as she played. When they hit the final chord, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly, someone started to clap. Victor, standing in the wings. The applause spread like wildfire until the entire hall was on their feet. Roberto lowered his violin, exhausted but lighter somehow. Cecilia rose from the piano bench on shaky legs. When he caught her, their embrace said everything words couldn't. A commotion near the stage drew their attention. Aguilera had broken away from the officer, rushing toward them. Security moved to intercept him, but Roberto held up his hand. "Let him speak." "The melody." Aguilera's voice cracked. "You finished it. You found the ending Carmen never could." "No." Cecilia took her father's hand. "She knew the ending all along. She was just waiting for the right time for it to be heard." Roberto's phone vibrated. A text from the hospital. Felicity was asking for them all. Even Victor, even Aguilera. As they left the stage, the audience still standing, still applauding, Roberto realized something. The melody that had haunted his dreams wasn't a ghost story after all. It was a love letter, written in sharps and flats, waiting 20 years to be delivered. The music had finally found its way home. 1 year later, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the renovated conservatory. The space, once haunted by secrets, now rang with children's laughter and fumbling scales. A sign above the door read, "Carmen's Music Academy for Gifted Youth." Roberto adjusted a young student's violin grip. "Remember, let the music breathe." Across the room, Felicity, her cheeks now rosy with health, helped a small girl navigate her first piano lesson. The white piano from upstairs had been restored and moved here, its keys no longer holding ghosts but possibility. "You're doing it again." Cecilia's voice came from behind him, that proud teacher smile. He turned to face her, still amazed by how his heart jumped at the sight of her. The past year had softened her edges, though her eyes still held shadows of their shared history. "The foundation approved our expansion plans," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist. 3 more locations by next spring. "Your father would be proud." They both glanced at the framed photo on the wall. Aguilera conducting the prison orchestra he'd started during his rehabilitation program. His sentence had been reduced in exchange for cooperation and community service. Speaking of proud, Cecilia's hand drifted to her stomach, still flat but holding their secret. "How should we tell everyone?" Before Roberto could answer, Victor burst through the door, his usual dramatic entrance making several students giggle. The Moscow Conservatory loved our outreach proposal. They want us to... He stopped, noting their intimate pose. Noi, am I interrupting something? Always, Roberto laughed, but there was no malice in it. Their former rival had become family, his dedication to the school matching their own. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the hardwood floors as the last students filed out. Felicity stayed at the piano, picking out a familiar melody, the one that had brought them all together. "It's different now," she said softly. "The music, it doesn't hurt anymore." Roberto sat beside her, adding a harmony. Cecilia joined with a counter-melody, and even Victor contributed a pizzicato line on his violin. The piece that had once held so much pain now felt like a lullaby. "I've been thinking," Cecilia said when they finished, "about names for the baby." She pulled out a worn piece of paper, one of Carmen's letters they'd discovered in the diary. She wrote about what she would have named her next child. Roberto's throat tightened. What was it? Hope? Cecilia's eyes glistened. In any language, in any key, she wanted her music to speak of hope. The lesson room door creaked open, revealing Maria, the housekeeper, now their school administrator, smiled knowingly. "A package arrived from your father, Miss Cecilia. Sheet music for the children's program." Inside the package, they found something else. A journal entry Aguilara had written in prison, finally confessing every detail of that night. Not for the courts, but for them. For healing. Victor read it first, his hands shaking. He's going to tell the whole story at his parole hearing. Everything about Milan, about Carmen. No more secrets. Felicity moved to the white piano, her fingers finding the keys that had once melted in flames. The melody she played was Carmen, but the harmony was new, something born from ashes, nurtured by forgiveness. "You know what this means?" Roberto gathered them all close. "It's time to write our own music." As twilight painted the conservatory in shades of gold, four broken people made whole by truth, and time sat together, adding their voices to a song that had waited a generation to be completed. And somewhere, in the space between notes, Carmen smiled. Spring sunlight flooded the concert hall as 5-year-old Miguel Aguilara took his first steps onto a professional stage. His dark curls and gray eyes were Cecilia's, but the way he held Roberto's old violin, that was pure Carmen. "Ready, mijo?" Roberto knelt beside his son. Miguel nodded, his small fingers positioning themselves with inherited grace. In the front row, Cecilia watched through tears, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. Beside her sat Felicity, now a composed young woman running the Academy's scholarship program, and Victor, who had flown in from Moscow just for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice filled the hall. "For our final performance, Miguel Aguilara will play a recently discovered composition by Carmen Aguilar, completed by her son Roberto." The piece began softly, a child's lullaby that grew into something deeper. Roberto stood in the wings, remembering how they'd found the fragment of melody scribbled in the margins of his mother's last diary entry. It had taken months to understand. This wasn't just a song, but a message to a grandchild she would never meet. Miguel played with uncanny confidence, each note clear and true. In his hands, the violin that had once played for spare change in a train station now sang of legacy and love. From his special permission seat in the audience, Aguilara wept silently, his prison uniform stark against the elegant crowd. His Grandin's music spoke of forgiveness in a way words never could. Halfway through, Miguel glanced at his father and nodded. Roberto joined him on stage with his new violin, and together they performed the duet Carmen had somehow known would one day exist. The melody wove between them, grandmother, father, son, bridging generations with each bow stroke. In the front row, Cecilia began to hum along, a habit she'd developed during pregnancy. The baby inside her kicked in rhythm. As the final notes faded, Miguel lowered his violin and smiled. Carmen's smile, everyone would later say. The audience erupted in applause, but Roberto barely heard them. He was lost in his son's eyes, seeing his mother's gift living on. "Papa!" Miguel tugged his sleeve. "Did I play it right? The way she would have wanted?" Roberto gathered his son close. "Better, mijo. You made it your own." Later, as they all gathered in the renovated white piano room, now a family space filled with photos and children's drawings, Aguilara asked to speak. "The parole board's decision comes tomorrow. he said quietly. But regardless, seeing Miguel play today, Carmen's music living on, he stopped, overcome. Grandfather? Miguel climbed into his lap, something he'd only recently started doing. Will you tell me about her? About my grandmother? Cecilia reached for Roberto's hand as Aguilara began to speak, telling their son stories of a red-haired woman who believed music could heal any wound, bridge any distance, forgive any sin. The setting sun painted the white piano gold, and from somewhere in the house came the faint sound of scales, students practicing in the academy below. Roberto closed his eyes, remembering the melody that had haunted his dreams so long ago. It didn't feel like a nightmare anymore, but a gift, passed down through blood and bone and string. The baby's kicking, Cecilia whispered. Why? Right where Miguel used to practice his violin. Remember? Roberto placed his hand on her belly, feeling their daughter's rhythm. Another musician in the making, another chapter in Carmen's song. Outside, spring rain began to fall, its gentle percussion accompanying the last light of day. In this room where tragedy had once lived, a family born from ashes and music looked toward tomorrow, their hearts beating in time with a melody that had finally found its way home. Miguel picked up his violin once more, unprompted. The song he played was new, his own composition, but with echoes of Carmen's theme woven through it, a legacy continuing, a love story without end. And in the space between notes, if you listened closely, you could hear a red-haired woman laughing, her music living on in the next generation's hands.